We're going to be talking about 5 things I wish I knew when starting out buying vintage wristwatches. My name's Daniel Somlo and this is The Luxury of Time. Now, buying vintage wristwatches is an expensive hobby. Nobody is under any illusions there. But that's why it's so important to avoid these fundamental pitfalls that can catch anybody out, including me, when I was first starting out. Number 1, where are you buying from? This is a big one because you can buy vintage wristwatches all over the place. Car boot sales, thrift shops, eBay, auction houses, high-end retailers, the list goes on. Now, full disclosure, you can buy from any of these places and still get a great wristwatch. But chances are, if you're watching this video, you're probably not a vintage watch expert. So it's important that you understand how to manage the risks. When buying from somewhere like a thrift shop or car boot sale, you probably know about as much, if not more, than the seller does about the watch. You're literally buying something without any idea of where it's come from, who originally owned it, what condition it's in, or if it's even real. Now with eBay, which is a popular place, you get a little bit more assurance, but honestly, not much. Aside from the fact that you're buying a watch sight unseen, with the majority of these things being returns not accepted, if you don't really know what you're doing, you're going to have problems. The way the photographs are actually taken, or the information that may or may not be omitted from the listings, can really skew what it is you're looking at. Even I've fallen victim to this when I was first starting out. But let me tell you, it's a mistake you only make once. Then there's auction houses. You can get some great watches from auction, but you have to be aware that there are often extra costs associated. There are premiums to pay, which can be as much as 30%, and not to mention, again, like eBay, you're buying the watch as is. So it'll need servicing, it's often unverified, and once again, you have to be cautious about flattering photography. Also, just because a watch is in a big auction doesn't mean that all the parts are actually original or even period correct. There are no guarantees. Now, specialist retailers are generally the safest place to buy. The watches are usually fully serviced and guaranteed. With some watches, you can even get the extra assurance in the form of an extract from the brand's archives, which is a confirmation that the movement and the case number matched originally. For example, we are the first and only official Omega Vintage store in the world, which means that over half of our stock is devoted to vintage Omega. Every Omega that we sell is serviced and comes with a 2-year guarantee, as well as an extract from the Omega archives, which says to the day when the watch was made and where it was sent to. Number 2, being seduced by the price. Money is a powerful thing. Vintage watches can often be a great bargain when compared to their modern counterparts. You can get a solid gold, mechanical, vintage Patek Philippe dress watch for around £10,000 or just over $12,000. And you won't be waiting until the next generation before you can take delivery. But when you find a vintage Patek for £1,500 or $2,000, there is almost always a reason. Maybe the movement is wrong. Maybe there are missing parts and it can't be repaired. Maybe it's a fake. Either way, all sellers are more than capable of Googling Patek Philippe and seeing what kind of caliber that company is. So if you find one that's that much of a steal, there's almost always a reason for it. The feeling of showing some expert this expensive watch that you found for an incredible bargain, them looking at it and saying, that's not how you spell Vacheron. Number 3. Forgetting about the servicing. One of the most common things that people forget when buying a vintage watch is the after-sales side of things. A lot of the watches that you're going to want to buy are old, really old, like 50 plus years old. And what many people don't think about is that vintage watches are machines, and as such they need to be maintained, serviced, lubricated and checked for wear. In a similar way to how a car requires servicing periodically, and bearing in mind that cars are only used sparingly, generally for short periods every day, a watch is running constantly, so there's constant wear on the movement. This can actually be more complicated for vintage watches, as the skills needed to service them and the availability of parts is much more difficult to get hold of. Companies like Patek Philippe have been known to take years to service certain vintage watches and can charge thousands for the privilege. This is one of the reasons why buying from a reputable dealer who offers guarantees can be such a bonus. Number 4, A little knowledge is dangerous. A little research can give you a false sense of confidence that when you find that certain little identifying feature on a watch and you're looking to buy it, but you may not know to look for other features which could be big red flags to someone with more hands-on experience. The internet is by far the worst culprit. There are some fantastic sources of information out there, and the internet has truly revolutionized how we research watches. But remember, anyone can write something on the internet. Anyone with a little knowledge and the skills to make a professional looking website can become a tool that people use as a source of information, even though it actually has no grounding or any knowledge associated with it. There's usually no affiliation to the brand and no experts who actually do any fact checking. But sites like this have become sources of information to people who don't know any better, and people have fallen victim to it. Books are another danger area. When something's written down in a book, there is an inherent rightness to it. People feel like it's a work that's been published and verified and checked, but this often isn't the case. In reality, a lot of these books were written by people with agendas, but even if we're not being cynical, they were also written with the best information that was available to people at the time. This can become outdated as new information comes to light. This book on old clocks and watches is considered to be a very important information source on antique watches and watchmakers. However, this book was written and published in 1911, when people thought that smoking was healthy. An example with wristwatches, however, is one of my favourites. It's the Speedmaster Ultraman. It was a watch that was made in the late 60s, and it looks for all intents and purposes like an old Speedmaster, but with an orange chronograph hand. If you go back 15 years, most authorities did not believe that this was a real watch. They thought it was put together or some weird custom thing. Now it's considered one of the rarest prototype production runs of a Speedmaster, with very few examples existing, and it has to have a specific length hand, a specific kind of dial, and fall within a certain serial range. Just how the information has evolved. Learning and information only works when you combine it with actual hands-on experience. I have seen thousands of Speedmasters, and I have an inherent sense of what looks right and what isn't right, and that's something you can only do from handling so many watches. Just doing research is the equivalent of learning how to swim by watching YouTube videos. It just doesn't really work. Number 5, try before you buy. Let's take a modern example. The first A-Lange Söhne Datograph. An absolutely gorgeous watch. Triumph in design, and the movement is probably one of the prettiest things I've ever seen in my entire life. I love that watch. I can't wear it though. It just does not look right on my wrist. It's too big for me. And that's something I'm very sad about, but I will live with it. But if I didn't try that watch on, then I wouldn't know. But vintage watches are even harder to do this with. With a modern watch, if you try one on, then you know what they all look like. But with vintage watches, you can have two watches which were made on the same day 60 years ago, the exact same specifications, and today they'll look completely different. Condition is king, and it's something that you really can't capture in photographs. It's something you need to see. Where are you buying them from? Being seduced by the price, servicing, a little knowledge is dangerous, and trying before you buy. I'm Dan Somlo, and thank you very much for watching. You can look on our Instagram for some amazing pictures of watches, or even better, come into our store and see them. Try them for yourself.